Hello.
Welcome to Inside the Rookery, Season 4, Episode 10. Apologies for the no intro video this week. Who knows what happened to it? It must be on winter holidays. So we are today joined by well, we were joined by Jonathan Green, who is now
Slick.
showing as a completely unconnected device. He's back! Hooray! So we're joined by Jonathan Green. Yes, we definitely are now. And we are going to be talking about gaming the classics tonight. Absolutely and completely slick. So Jonathan's sound has gone weird, he tells me. So let us just see. Nod if you can hear us, Jonathan.
I can hear you, but I can then hear you saying all this again about 10 seconds later.
Okay.
You don't have
let's
another
see.
tab open, do you? You haven't maybe got it open in two different tabs? Because that happened to me when I had Twitch open or Twitter or Facebook or
Just
something
bear with
else.
me and I'll just close everything else.
In the meantime, why don't I share a link to Jonathan's Kickstarter?
Yeah,
Marvelous.
let's do that.
That'd be a
Seagull
nice thing to
says
do.
very slick. You're right, Seagull. You went first today. It was
What a
very
marvelous beginning to the stream, huh?
So today we are going to be talking
Ooh.
about gaming the classics.
I
Hopefully,
think
if
it's
Jonathan now has just once just
think
hearing
it's
us
good,
once.
sorry.
Excellent. So as always,
You
jump
can
into
edit
the
this, yeah?
chat.
We're not live or anything.
No, it's
No.
fine.
Ask any questions, add any comments, and I'll bring them up on screen. And we have plenty of questions pre-submitted, which we will chat to Jonathan about while you are listening and commenting. So to jump straight in, we've got a general question from Lazy Cat. So what do you mean by classics? Genre classics like Bram Stoker's Dracula, or classics like Homer's Iliad, or maybe Austen's Jane Eyre?
I think any and all of the above. I mean, to be honest, if you've already heard of it, then it's
a
out of
classic.
copy, right? Then it's a classic. Yes. Because I've forgotten who it was now, but it might have been Terry Pratchett, or it might be somebody else completely before him, but saying, an author can only hope to be read within his own time or their own time. So if it's lasted longer than the person has, then it's probably a classic. Yeah. Or it's on some school syllabus somewhere, but that might not necessarily be the same thing.
We hope it is, but often not. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of ones I'm interested in, there's one of those I've already turned into a game book, and not the other. One of the others is something similar to that. I'd like to do something using the Greek classics. I've got a plan, and I'm jumping the gun.
Well, talking of the Greek classics, I actually like some of the Roman classics. So when I was at school, I studied Latin. There was 5 of us, and we got taught in a cupboard. And then higher, there was 2 of us. So I won the prize. It was a pretty big achievement to win that prize in a class of 2. So I had to translate for my higher Latin, I think Virgil's Aeneid. So I'm a bit partial to the Aeneid. But my favorite adaptation of the Aeneid isn't actually advertised anywhere as an adaptation or an interpretation, but I have decided it is, and it's The Adjustment Bureau with Matt Damon and what's her name? The Emily
Blunt, isn't it? Yeah, I really enjoy that film.
Well, watch it again. It is basically what would happen if Dido and Aeneas had defied the gods instead of essentially Aeneas getting on with his quest to found Rome. Like, look at it in that, and I guarantee you'll think of it in a different way. I love that film, and I love that story, and Dido, or Alyssa, whatever you want to call her, is just an unsung heroine of the classical era.
Because I didn't see it for years. I didn't see it at the cinema, and it was on TV one night, and I've seen it about 4 or 5 times, and I don't know what it is about it, but I find it really watchable. And normally I'm not one to rewatch lots of things, particularly something with I mean, it's just the chemistry behind the characters I think is great. And anyway.
Yeah, and I think her name is even Alyssa in it or something. Like, her name actually, like, there's all sorts of things through it that if you looked for it, you could see.
Oh, I'm gonna have to watch it again tonight.
Like, I searched, I googled it afterwards, and I couldn't really find, like, no one else was talking about this, and I was like, is this just me? So maybe.
Well, the George Clooney film,
Imagine it.
"Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" That's the Odyssey, isn't it?
You see?
Yeah.
So yeah. There we go. So
So,
yes, they
any
they
any
definitely count
classic.
as classics.
Yeah.
Yes, I
well,
mean,
and-
sorry, I also, to be honest, if it's any classic for me personally, I mean, I know we're just finding what's classics, but those which grab my interest in some way and I think I can do something interesting with as well would be one that I would then look to adapt.
I think in general for our own games as well, as we look back to our influences from our childhood, and it might be a book that we studied in English when we were younger, it might be something our parents introduced us to, but classics are often quite a personal thing beyond the overall general, it's a classic marker, because some people's classic is somebody else's. No, never heard of it. But yeah, if you're adapting your own ones, whatever is classic for your own table is also something that's worth looking at.
Yeah,
because then you don't need to worry about copyright too if it's just for your table.
Yes.
Like I agree, Andy. Like I'm going to say the controversial thing for an English teacher, but Thomas Hardy can get in the sea, as far as I'm concerned. I cannot stand Thomas Hardy's novels.
I sense a storm brewing.
I will never see them. But I suppose that's a good question, John. Like, is there anything? Obviously, you have adapted some classics. Looking into adapting more, like. Is there anything that you would like to adapt, but it's not a classic yet because it's still in copyright? I mention it just because there's a children's author I know called Anna James who does a series of books about book wandering, so about people who can go into books or bring characters from books into the world.
Yeah,
but she has to very carefully only refer to books that are out of copyright, which is slightly problematic for a children's author, particularly. Every time she does a school visit, the kids are like, "Why don't you do Harry Potter?" And she's like, "Well, I don't think J.K. Rowling would let me." So
that's a tricky one. Probably it's a simple answer. But I mean, there are some things I've already looked into getting the license for because it isn't out of copyright, which applies to one of the things we're going to talk about later anyway. But there is, I don't want to say too much because it probably nothing will come of it, but there is a very well-known brand that I have approached about writing an adventure game book for. But it's very, very early days. So I'm not sort of holding out too much hope. But if it does come about, you'll definitely hear about it.
Excellent. And we'll have you back on to tell us all about it. Yeah.
But yes, that's it's a good point. I'm now, I suppose, it wasn't one that I suggested, but somebody tagged me in something last year saying that, Winnie the Pooh's going out of copyright. So I'm expecting to see an adventure game book by you. And I thought, no, I'm not interested in that at all. Partly because I thought if you want all the characters, you've got to wait, I think it's till next year before they're all out of copyright, like Tigger and co. And I realised there's Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. Is it coming out, the horror film? But I've now got an idea because somebody planted that seed.
Yeah. Well, definitely. I mean, it could be maybe a nice way of pitching an adventure book, maybe at a slightly younger audience. To kind of...
no, mine would be horribly dark.
Well, you're going the other way.
Yes. The cover I've got, it would be called 100 Acre Wood, but as it's written by Christopher Robin on the map, so it's misspelt, and it would be in the Pet Cemetery font, and it would be Pet Cemetery meets Winnie the Pooh.
I love it. I love it. I'm sold. Shut up and take my money. I want it.
But I may never do this because my wife loves Winnie the Pooh, and I think it would just be so mean. Yes. So I can see Lindsay's face. That would be my wife would be less contained than that.
I just couldn't imagine poor Piglet or Roo. Not Roo. Don't you dare touch him. No. Will there be gnomes in it? I don't think there's any gnomes in Winnie the Pooh.
I don't think so.
Really not.
No, that's just our resident gnomeaholic.
Yeah.
We'll always ask a question about gnomes. So yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Seago asks, so adapting literature to a game, is it as simple as writing out the plot and characters, or is there more to it than this?
Well, obviously, I'm going to say it's not a simple process at all, which is why I need to support authors. I mean, to be honest, there's an element. The way I approach it is, first of all, if it's a story that I think I could do something interesting with. And for some, that means I've changed it quite a lot for one reason or another. So, for example, Peter Pan, which became Neverland, Here Be Monsters. I'm not a massive fan of Peter Pan. And when I came to sort of reread it, it was quite twee, dare I say. Although Captain Hook is quite a a tough character when it mentions that he kills somebody just to prove what a badass he is. But everything's better with dinosaurs. So I put dinosaurs in Peter Pan, and I made it something I'd want to read, and hopefully other people do too. So yeah, sometimes it's.
I can't believe you don't like Peter Pan.
It is twee though, Lindsay. Come on. Even if you like it, it is twee. Because the tweeness might be the charm. I'm not saying
Alice in Wonderland is something special. And then I read the Wizard of Oz actually when I was a teacher, and I'd not read it before. And I didn't realize that the Wicked Witch features in one chapter. And there's so much more that goes on in that book, and it's so much more interesting.
And in fact, the whole Oz books as a whole are really quite fascinating to read through.
When I was a kid, I didn't have a TV, as is well known to many of the people in this stream. And
because you were a Victorian ghost?
No, because I lived in the country and wrote on slates in my primary school. Anyway, I didn't have a television, so I'd never seen The Wizard of Oz. So I actually read one of the later books. I think maybe Glinda, the one with the woman who has all the heads and she swaps her heads.
Yes, I've forgotten which one that is, but yeah.
I read them when I was a kid.
I read that first before I even knew what Wizard of Oz was, so it was kind of a weird, like, no context book to read, to come in right there with Dorothy being like, because I think she really likes Dorothy's head. I come from a town near Kirriemuir, which is where J.M. Barrie lived. So Peter Pan is, like, that's home territory. You've got
national
to be
hero.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
it is free, though. Yeah.
Yes, but going back to Seagoat's question, but then I've done the other extreme where I adapted Dracula, and I didn't do that for a while because I thought everyone's done Dracula. It's been adapted so many times, but that one I kept much more closely to the original book. Except that, so you can play, one of the features of my game books, not all of them, but some of them, is that you can play as different characters and their stories will intersect. So in Dracula, which I've just happened to have here, that one, Curse of the Vampire, you can play as one of the vampire hunters, so Jonathan Harker, Dr. Seward, or Mina Murray, or you can play as Dracula. So that one I effectively had to write from scratch from what Stoker hinted at and the fact that he's implied that it's Vlad Tepes. So I made it explicit, and it's all those sort of elements and how to bring it in. And because obviously the book's epistolary in style, if you play as that particular character, you only learn about the bits which that character experiences. And equally, you only get the whole Voyage of the Demeter if you play as Dracula, because playing as the captain isn't one of the options. So you then see it from the point of view of the creature that's killing the crew off one by one. So that was a different challenge, and it's also the longest game book I've ever written because it's 1,000 sections and 160,000 words.
That's going to be a big notepad of numbers. That'll be a big notepad of numbers to cross off.
It was. It's chunky.
And that's also a lovely way of ensuring replayability as well, isn't it? Because you're going to get a very different story depending which character you play.
And I did, to balance it out, I did add in some other details because I mean, people who've read the novel will know that all the adaptations, they gloss over so much of it. And one of the things which rereading it, I felt really sorry for Jonathan Harker because he's always made out to be this really wet individual. And yet he's the first one who experiences the horror firsthand in Dracula's castle. He's bled by the vampiresses or his brides, and he still manages to escape without anybody else's help. So he's yes, it breaks him mentally, but he's a tough character. And I want to sort of bring that back. And then I also added other things which, there's some references to Hammer horror films, and it'll take me ages to find the illustration, but the artist drew people like Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee into the illustrations. And there's also reference to Varney the Vampire from the Penny Dreadfuls from the 19th century.
Nice. There's also, whenever I read it, there's always more recipes in it than I remember. Yes.
And there's a lot. The other thing I did, which is slightly sacrilegious possibly, but there's a lot, particularly with Van Helsing, because again, in the movies, he's this vampire hunter. But in the book, he thinks it might be this, but he keeps going back to Amsterdam to do research to say, oh, this is where Lucy's buried. We'll come back in 2 days. No, you wouldn't. You get in there straight away. So I did sort of squeeze the time frames a little bit. Yeah.
The most recent adaptation of Dracula I watched was it the BBC, and it was a modern.
Oh, Stephen Moffat's one.
Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat. I really liked the first episode, and then as they progressed, I liked them less and less.
Yeah, I
Yes.
like the nun. The nun was particularly the
Yes.
one and like her initial interrogations.
Yeah, and the body horror stuff as well, and in
Yeah.
that one I thought were really good. But yes, then it's
Yeah, I would agree.
less
did go
good.
down.
It was almost great.
Oh yeah, that was the other thing that bugs me is, you know, that Dracula is this a misunderstood romantic hero. He's a monster.
It's absolute horror show.
He attacks Mina out of spite. It's nothing to do with she looks like his dead wife. And there's these things. It's a bit like, you know, one adaptation puts in, and suddenly it's taken as read that is how it is. It's like you know, Robin of Sherwood had a Saracen join the Merry Men, and suddenly Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, has a Saracen in it, and every version since I think has had a Saracen in it somewhere. Never in the original stories, but anyway.
Fair.
Let's see what is the best. Well, this is the wrong one. Best bit about the recipes is the fact that for the castle bit, Dracula must be cooking them.
Yes, that's one of the things I thought. Yeah, he spends all his time, and there are no other staff, and there's possibly his brides, but they're in a different wing. Absolutely. I mean, his list is calling. He should be some sort of celebrity chef.
You should come up to Edinburgh for the Fringe, Jonathan, if you've never been, because I saw Dracula in the Fringe many years ago, like many decades ago now, when I was on a school trip. And the Fringe is weird because you're just in like whatever venue they happen to have got. It could be an old church, which is where I saw Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes, and then we had to run across town from Something Wicked This Way Comes to a production of Dracula, which opened. I was sitting next to my English teacher and my best friend, which opened with like not Mina, the other one, just like naked
Lucy
on the stage, which was like excruciating. But then partway through, because it was the Fringe and they had to do something weird, Renfield came out like from under my seat with a dead pigeon.
I have to say, he's my favourite character in the book. I think he is the
with
most grotesque, and terrifying.
Dead pigeon. Oh my god!
Well, that'd be really bad. But the fact that
I screamed.
It's that, you know, Dracula is a vampire. They don't exist. You know, it's a monster. It's extreme. Renfield is a human being, and he does the most innocuous things, but eating flies is a bit freaky. And then the whole bit where he keeps the bird and suddenly it's disappeared. And then you get this report saying that one of the I've forgotten what they're called now, but the sort of wardens mentions that he'd been sick and there's feathers on his pillow, and you think that's really unpleasant. And it's those things that stick with me far more than, oh, there's something that can turn into smoke and bite people. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it stuck with me, just like the vision of him crawling out from under my seat with like blood everywhere and this dead pigeon like in his mouth. It was disgusting. Anyway.
That's really wow.
That's the Edinburgh Fringe for you.
Yay.
So Killishandra asks, what challenges are there adapting a classic setting to gaming that are not the case for creating typical games, if there are any?
The thing I find is that as much as I've talked about kind of obviously sticking very closely to Dracula and then diverging quite dramatically with others, if you're doing an adaptation of, for example, Peter Pan, there are certain beats you have to hit. Otherwise, why call it Peter Pan or anything to do with that, have those characters? So, you know, I've put my own spin on it, but in Neverland, well, one thing I added in is you think if Barry had written that now, his editor would have said, this whole bit where Peter Pan chops Captain Hook's hand off, we've got to have that in the opening chapter. That's got to be like the first, you know, in a movie, they put that in, except they don't now. So I added that back in. You know, you have the crocodile, you have the clock, you've got the lost boys, you've got the mermaids. I have got Tiger Lily, but she's a very different character. But there are beats you have to hit that people expect. And it's also balancing that then with the needs of the game and keeping some sort of balance to that. So I'd say that's the challenge, but then that also gives you a framework in which you can then diverge in other ways to keep people guessing. So although I've adapted things, there's always something. If you know the story, it's not a given that you'll complete the adventure. There's always something new or a slight twist on things, or you can even do it in that. One of the things I enjoyed with Dracula in particular is that the reader knows far more than the characters do. So it talks about, because you're reading it from Jonathan's point of view, for example, you know, he's talking about what a curious man his host is, or how, you know, I wonder where he goes to, or why doesn't he ever eat with me, and things like that. And you know far more than he does. So it's quite fun to play with that too.
And that's the great hook of like horror movies and things, isn't it? Is that
Yeah.
that dramatic irony of when the person goes to the basement, you're like, oh no, don't go to the basement, but they go
Yeah.
anyway. And
That building sense of dread as well.
But when readers first read Bram Stoker's Dracula, would they have known that much more than the reader?
Oh no, I don't think so at the time. I mean, rereading it sort of reminded me actually what a good book it is. Although, like I said, there's bits where it's possibly slightly long-winded, but there's so many details which I'd forgotten about, and which again aren't adaptations I've seen don't draw attention to it. So one that springs to mind is when Mina and Lucy are in Whitby and they go to the churchyard and they meet this old gentleman, and he talks about this person who committed suicide, and they realize they're on the grave of a suicide. And then there's a whole thing about Dracula comes ashore as a dog and then disappears, but he's in the grave of the suicide. And it's things like that, which are those little details. It's never made explicit, but that's what's going on. And again, that makes Dracula so unnatural in that he's come on shore as a creature and then he's snuck into somebody else's coffin and he's lying in there with their remains, just waiting. I mean, it's really sinister and really powerful. Yeah.
The description. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say the description when Jonathan's in his castle. And the first moment that he really knows something's going wrong, when he looks out the window and he sees Dracula like crawling up the wall.
That is my favorite image. That's why that's on the cover.
Yeah, it's so good because he's conveying this sense of alienness and unnaturalness to his movement in a way. And
he's still in human form, but he's crawling down the wall face first. That always stuck with me, which is
terrific.
Yeah, and you mentioned in Peter Pan, you mentioned Tiger Lily. So
yes,
some classics will have problematic things in them, aspects.
Lovecraft.
When they were written. So I love so Lazy asked, how do you best handle problematic aspects of classical literature when adapting them to games? So you mentioned you made Tiger Lily a very different character.
Yeah, so I actually
make you do that?
because it is Peter Pan meets the Lost World. I got rid of the Pickaninny tribe completely, and they are the Akala, which is the tribe that are described in the Lost World. So that immediately got rid of it. And then my original premise of the book was, what if Neverland was Skull Island from King Kong? And I think it's Kong Skull Island where they have the people who live there have clearly been shipwrecked over possibly hundreds of years. And there's really homogenous race. There's all sorts of different ethnicities in there who've intermarried. So I kind of play with that a little bit in that as well. But then in terms of Tiger Lily herself, she is just this, in the original, she's just there to be saved. She has no personality. It's just for Peter to be a hero. So I wanted to change that completely. So in the book, she's one of the tribe and she starts her adventure doing her rites of passage hunt. So she's called Tiger Lily because she rides a saber-toothed tiger. That's part of how the tribe sort of named their children. So she's the only character who can fight dinosaurs right from the outset. Everybody else, if they attempted to do that, would be killed. She's probably the toughest character in the book and was a lot of fun to write as a result, and sort of, again, playing with people's expectations.
But presumably you've kept the Lost Boys, because there's a whole bit at the start of Peter Pan where he just waffles on about how the reason it's only boys that are Lost Boys is because girls are not stupid enough to fall out of their perambulators.
Yes, that is something which
that's why there's no lost girls.
I changed that quite a lot, because the whole Peter and his origin and why he doesn't grow old is a different thing in the book. So to cut a long story short, he's a steampunk cyborg. So after a horrific accident, he was saved by his dad. So he doesn't know how long he's going to live. So it could be that he'll live indefinitely, but as a result, he's not getting any older either. So if that makes any sense, he's not physically aging in that sense in growing up. So yeah, I did avoid that. And there are Lost Boys after a fashion, but they're the Morlocks from H.G. Wells's Time Machine.
Nice
Mixture of the classics there, if ever there was one.
Yeah.
Loosely to answer on this question, how best to handle it. If you could take, and in addition to what's already been discussed, the two primary routes that's most commonly discussed around Lovecraft. The first one being, say, how Call of Cthulhu handled it, which was to effectively push it all aside, write a very big open piece about it saying, we are drawing from a problematic source, and this is our opinions on said source, and this is what we think you should do to progress forward. And then basically siphon out all of the problematic elements and then just present a really cool setting. Or alternatively, you can do something a little bit more akin to, say, what Lovecraft Country did, where instead of effectively distancing themselves from everything, they directly tackled everything that was problematic about it and made their story that was drawn out of that setting about the very problematic elements that the setting at hand demonstrated in perhaps not the best way. So that's two other ways you could potentially tackle it.
Yeah, one of the things I had fun with Neverland is there's a scene where Tiger Lily and Wendy Darling meet, and if you can play as either character, so you see it from both points of view. But if you're playing as Wendy Darling, she's an Edwardian in this because she starts off, she's one of the survivors of the Titanic. That's why she ends up washed up on Neverland. But when she meets Tiger Lily, she's sort of appalled by how wild this young woman looks and underdressed and all these tattoos, and talks about tattoos are only for Jolly Jack Tars and this sort of thing. And then if you see it from Tiger Lily's point of view, she's like, well, who's this pathetic, pasty skinned? She hasn't got a weapon. Where are her rites of passage scars? What's going on? Who is she? So it was fun to play it that way. But then also you talking about problematic elements. Coming out later this year is Herot, which is a role-playing game I've written based on one of my other books, Beowulf Beastslayer. And in that, it makes reference to slaves because it's set during the Viking era, and those people kept slaves. Mm-hmm. And I talk a little bit about structure of society, but that's all I've done with it. There aren't any slave characters who appear in the story. There's not the option to play as somebody from that background. It's just this is part of the world. And I've taken the approach, this is historical, this is how it was, it doesn't mean how we are now. I have seen other games where it's made explicit and they have a whole section saying, about enslaved people, this isn't right. And I can understand completely why they've done it. But personally, I feel, I have to be very careful how I phrase this now. But I mean, I've written a book for adults and I hope people will be adult in their approach when they read it and play the game. So.
And with Vikings were very much equal opportunity slavers. They would enslave anyone. And everyone.
Yeah, and equally slaves could buy themselves out of slavery. So it's, I would think, more akin to Roman society than possibly when we think about slaves now in certain cultures, certainly.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Right, so let's have a look. Oh no, we'll go to this one first. So Caravan asks, how do you deal with your players knowing the primary plots?
Well, I think I probably already answered that. I mean, there's the element where it's fun, when you know that, and then subverting people's expectations. That's one way of doing it. It's that, like I said already, where the players know more than the characters possibly do. So it's not as simple as saying, well, this is going on because the character wouldn't know that. And then there's the classic, well, you do tweak the story. So it still gives people a surprise, and it's not. So I've done the same thing because Beowulf, what I did discover in writing that is lots of people know about Beowulf and Grendel and possibly about Grendel's mother, but so many people didn't realize that he fights a dragon later in his life. Mm-hmm. So that in itself seemed to be a surprise for a lot of people. But then even if you know all that, there's still elements where, because it's a game book, you can make your own choices. So spoiler warning, but in Beowulf, at the end, he dies. And it is possible in the game book to not die, but it's quite hard because the epic has written that's his fate. But there is a way to get out of that, but it's quite convoluted. But it's quite fun putting that in for people. So yeah, I mean, there's I guess that's three different approaches, isn't it? Is you play up to it, you subvert it, or you just play with the characters and the players themselves being different people with different knowledge.
I think for me that do you want to go?
No, please go on.
Okay, for me, I think the subversion of expectations can be one of the strongest aspects of playing upon player knowledge. Because players inevitably, when they move into their game, will have certain expectations. And when those expectations are matched once, twice, three times, they start getting into a comfortable groove. And then you can start dropping hints that things are going to be a little bit different, perhaps. And that can unnerve in a way that is quite unexpected for people who have not necessarily gone through an adventure that concerns something they already know. Because it can add a level of discomfort it's almost visceral as things start adding in that are weird and different to what their expectation. Then when it comes in hard and it's different and it makes sense within the world that you've created, everyone goes, oh, wow! And it can create a far stronger emotional grip to the piece that you're doing. So yeah, I particularly love that aspect of it.
Yeah, if you've chosen as well to play a game that is clearly based on an existing story and plays those characters, there must be an element where you also want to experience those plot points and those scenes, and possibly it means you can say, well, this is how I would react in that situation. But there is that element of that's what people are bought into, so you don't want to disappoint.
Yeah, and I think like if it's more like tabletop role playing games rather than adventure books, so like say Call of Cthulhu is a good example. Like what you're going for is almost more like the tone and the theme.
Yes,
and
yeah,
the
absolutely.
World,
I mean,
rather than the
That's certainly true of my current Kickstarter, he says, subtly shoehorning it in.
Terrific segue.
Just amazing. So yeah, the Box of Delights, the role-playing game that is funding on Kickstarter right now, and needs your support, please. But obviously, I'm following the story. I mean, for certain, when Andy, you mentioned about classics being something you introduced to as a child, I, like many people of a certain age, I'd imagine, watched the 1984 TV adaptation of the Box of Delights. And I played up to that with the Kickstarter video because I've used similar imagery and the same music and things like that at the start to kind of hook people's in with the nostalgia. But then having read the book since myself, again, you realize what they changed of the TV and things they left out. And again, I have to be tactful because I have licensed the book from the family estate, but I can understand why they made those changes for the TV series, and I'm making some changes of my own. But yeah, it's creating that particular tone so you can experience a similar story. And while you meet Abner Brown, you meet Cole Hawling as the Punch and Judy man, there are other bits where you can just roam around and explore. So, for example, Condicott, which is the town that they sort of based in and around, you can explore that and go to other places, which are just mentioned in passing in the story. There might be one scene. There's some I think possibly weren't even in the TV series, but again, where you can then do the more RPG thing of we're a group of friends, we want to go and do this and look in here and see what this person's doing.
I'm not familiar with the 1984 box.
Because you're a Victorian ghost.
A sad time for me.
I've watched. It's one of those things that does hold up. I have watched it since a few times. There are some things you think, "Oh, that was amazing." You watch it again as an adult and go, "That is so bad." I used to love Mr. Men books, and then when I was reading to my children, it's like half of these have the same plot.
Yeah, they're pretty much the same thing again.
Yeah, and they're also some of them
Anybody
are
who's
also
silly or
quite
funny,
mean.
it's the same story. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
they're also quite like mean and unpleasant to certain characters. I'm not. Yeah, looking back at the Mr. Men books, they're not brilliant.
They're
they're cute, iconic art is what they are, and then the actual stories to justify the art.
Again, some of that can see where they're colouring in with the felt tips and over the lines.
But I like that though. Yeah, that's my level of art.
Okay. But yeah, so I'm certainly using that Macefield story as to create a certain atmosphere, whilst also expanding on certain elements that are hinted at. Because there are some elements of the story where, well, it certainly starts off very mysterious. He's a wizard. He's described as a wizard, and he talks to rats, and he's got a brass head that he talks to, and there's the boy trapped under the well behind the waterfall. Sorry. And then at the end of the book, again, have to be careful, spoilers, he's just a criminal robbing jewels. And it's really kind of, oh, that's a bit of a letdown. So I'm playing up much more to the whole, we're a coven of witches thing. And there's a darker plot strand, which hopefully concludes. But then again, there's some awesome things like the flying car, which is in the TV series. But there's weirder stuff than that in the book. When they explore Abner Brown's base beneath Chester Hills, where this supposed seminary, all sorts of weird sort of technomancy almost. So I want to play up to that as well.
I don't know why, but it's bringing to mind Stig of the Dump, the children's book, where like for most of it, you're just
Also
like down
watched
at the dump talking to Stig and bringing him food and stuff, and then suddenly they like time travel to Stone Age Britain. They're like this whole fantastic adventure.
That's quite an element of that. And saying literature, that must be of what, the 60s and or earlier. But certainly in the Box of Delights, it is real magical realism, because there's one bit where they'll shrink, or that's it, when they have a little bit when they're escaping from Abner Brown and his men, and they shrink down and go on the boat which they've been playing with on the river, and they ride the boat. And then later on, nobody ever talks about this. Nobody says, wasn't that weird? It's all just completely taken at face value. which you could argue maybe it's children playing a game and this is just part of the story. But again, it's just that magical realism where it's fine. That happened, whatever.
Yeah, I think there's a lot like the Weird Stone of Brisingamen. I remember the BBC did a radio adaptation of that, and like I watched or listened or read them all around about the same time, and they're all kind of set in like somewhere normal, but maybe a bit like old and spooky in Britain, and then just it explodes into sheer weirdness.
Yeah, because isn't it Alderley Edge, the Weird Stone of Brisingamen? And it's kind
I
of
think so.
it's not exactly the peripheries of civilization, but although they're really near all sorts of conurbations, it's out in the countryside, away
Wildness,
from
yeah.
anybody else. And I have to say, I love the Weird Stone of Brisingamen. And there's a really, really claustrophobic passage when they're underground, which really stuck with me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Maybe that would be some books I'd like to adapt, which is still in copyright.
Yeah.
Dear Mr. Garner.
So, how do you best? We're just talking about tone and remembering passages and phrases from books. So, how do you best conjure the tone of another era without becoming obscure or exclusive?
Something, when I do these, I do reread the original. And so I kind of immerse myself in it. And I suppose when I come to write it, I try and reflect that, whilst at the same time, I'm not sort of copying out passages verbatim, obviously. So it will inevitably be my own writing style. And there are certain things which over the years I've become more aware of that I do. And so I think it's possibly the mix of the two, is that it's my voice at the end of the day, but I'm mimicking a particular author's voice at the same time. So it gives it that tone whilst still obviously being a modern written book and therefore easily read. I mean, I suppose the one which is weirdest is Beowulf Beastslayer, because it's not a poem. I didn't write it as a poem, and I didn't write it in Old English, but it is written in an epic style. So I do play up to kennings a lot, which,
nice.
If anybody doesn't know, are the sort of
short
poetic phrases. Yeah, and I did lots with a 2-word, and I even played up. So they were kind of code words that you'd write down, but they were all in the form of kennings. Nice. I sort of really played up to that sort of thing. So when you meet a killer whale, for example, it's not just a killer whale, it's blackfish, it's sea, it's wave rider, it's blah, blah, blah. So, and people have comments on what comes through.
I've got upstairs, I've got a book called The Word Hoard, which I was literally, funnily enough, just reading today, which is just filled
Someone
with
else might
kennings.
have it.
Yeah.
Yep, that's
like
the one.
Fish's
My
bath,
wife gave me it for Christmas.
sea candle. Yeah.
Yeah.
The interesting thing in there is they talk about hapaxes. So a hapax is where it's a kenning or a word that only occurs, they've only found it maybe once. So you don't have any other sources to confirm, like, did that poet just make it up? And there's a few kennings in there where they're like, would they have called that in everyday kennings, or is the poet just taken that kind of creative license because in Old English alliteration was so important and they just needed a word to add on the front of candle, like they call the sun the sea candle in one poem, and then they're like, is that just because of alliteration, or is it because, like, these people were living on the coast, and so the sun always like rises from the
very
sea,
close to
and
the
so
sea.
it's the sea candle.
Yeah.
I'm obsessed with kennings. I love kennings.
Or maybe it's just some pretentious scop, just I don't know if you've seen Upstart Crow, but when Shakespeare's family say, "Why do you write like this?" It's what I do. It's how I do it. But Dad, it's nobody understands what you're talking about. It's just like that.
Flipped Up says they should get that book, and yeah, you definitely should. I found what was quite interesting is I've written notes all through it where, because the person who wrote it is so knowledgeable in Old English, but I don't think she speaks a Scandinavian language, and there's so many bits where she's like, oh, this is like the English word, and I'm like, and that's like the Norwegian word, like that's so interesting. The crossovers in the language. So yeah, I hope you're enjoying it too.
Oh yes,
yeah, it's a good book. I have been reading it while I sat on the loo. You all needed to know that.
Otherwise known as what would be a kenning for the loo? The porcelain throne.
The porcelain throne, exactly. I sit there with my book.
I think the reading chair. No.
Shanks's seat.
The reading drop.
Yeah. So Seago asks, are short stories the sort of thing one should start with trying to convert, and not the 5-part omnibus edition? or any particular book?
Yes, I would probably say. I mean, certainly it depends if you've done it before or not, and like you say, what you want to do, particularly if you're thinking about for a gaming group. And if one goes well, then you can continue. But obviously, it depends how much inspiration you want to take from it. Before we went live, and they were talking about other things that were inspired by well-known stories, or the Greek myths, or the Roman myths, and you can you watch a film or play through an adventure, and you think, oh, that's this story retold that way. But it's as simple as that. It's I mean, I suppose in terms of ones I've done, more unsubtle plugs, but this is actually the one that's most recently in print. Ronin 47 is my first science fiction ace game book, and it's obviously based on the legend of the 47 Ronin, but I've literally taken the revenge plot and some names, and that's it, and it's my own thing, and it's set in the future, and it's kaiju and giant robots and things. So that's one where I've really just taken the trappings and just thinking, this would be fun, what can I do with it now? And then there's others like Dracula, which was a massive massive job to convert that. But so yes, I mean, it's like, I would argue, if you want to be a writer, start with a short story. Partly it's although writing short stories and novels are different skills, it partly gives you the satisfaction of finishing something. And certainly I quite like to do it if I've written a longer book. Sometimes just have a palate cleanse of writing something much shorter can be quite a nice and refreshing change before you embark on another marathon rather than a sprint. Yeah.
If we're discussing just creating something for your own games, I would say, rather than worrying about whether you're trying to adapt a short story or trying to adapt something longer, I would go for just one primary criteria, and that is, are you excited by it? Does it make you go, yes, I want to do this because it's going to be awesome? Because if so, that passion will not only transfer over into whatever it is you create, but also transfer over into the game that you present to others. So definitely go for the one you like.
Yeah, like
absolutely. Sorry, Lindsay.
I was just going to say, there's some things that I absolutely adored when I was a child that I wouldn't go back to for any particular inspiration for writing in a role-playing setting, like all the school stories I used to read. Like, I loved them when I was a kid, but like there's not really much in those, whereas some like classics that you read when you were a kid, you can go back to as an adult and see in a different way, and read them in a different way than you read them when you were 8 and then 12 and then 16.
Definitely, yeah. That's this will be a bit weird now, but that's one of the things which, although my children are teenagers now, but some of the things that they used to watch and they were absolutely loved, and then you'd watch as an adult with different eyes, and you'd think, actually, this is really clever and this is really quite funny. And I thought things like Peppa Pig and also Ben and Holly's Magic Kingdom, whatever it's called, those sort of things, I just thought, partly because I think they're both produced by the team that did the 80s comedy show Absolutely, and it sort of shows through in some of the things, the humor in it. So yes, I think, absolutely right.
Yeah, whereas all the boarding school books I read, I did go back and read some of them recently, and they were actually shocking in terms of.
I can't believe you wouldn't want to adapt a Nazi-supporting Austrian chalet school. What's not to love?
No, they rebelled against the Nazis and made their own peace league. I think you'll find, Andy.
I apologize.
Actually, talking about well-loved children's books and going back as adults, I only heard this recently, and I've forgotten where I've heard it, but when Stieg Larsson wrote The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, apparently he was imagining what would Pippi Longstocking be like when she grew up.
Oh, wow.
So apparently that was his motivation, or part of it. So there you go. Pippi Longstocking as an adult, Girl with the Dragon Tattoo.
I don't even know what to say to that. I'm scunnered. I'm slightly... Yeah, there you go.
Talking about and Scandinavian influence, when we were talking earlier about some of the problematic aspects of books, I've always found Roald Dahl, like I wouldn't really want to go back and take them. Yeah, he was hugely clever and hugely creative, but when I've gone back and read them with the kids, like the level of body horror that turns into body shaming and morality being tied to attractiveness is actually really quite shocking when you look back at those books.
And he really didn't like children, did he?
No.
So
yeah.
Morality being tied to attractiveness is almost a core theme of
his books. Yeah.
whether it's the Twits or Matilda or
the
in fact,
witches.
I just call the witches.
All of them.
All
All of
yeah.
them. Yeah.
Ugly
I mean,
is evil.
Yeah. Also, massive anti-Semite as well. So
Oh,
that
I
kind of
didn't
gets
know
brushed
that.
over. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay.
People don't like talking about that, but yeah.
Yeah. So Mark McGranahan says, "Is there a Mr. James RPG on the topic of classics?" Kind of seems like
MR
something
James.
MR James.
Mr. James.
We were talking about my brother earlier. MR James.
I don't know if I'm sure you guys have a much better knowledge of RPGs than I do, but I'm not aware of specifically an MR James RPG. But
and as it turns out, yes, there is.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Link in the comments, people.
It uses Gumshoe.
So does everybody play as uptight academics?
I presume so. or they play Mr. James.
No. What I was thinking of was, I was like, is that a children's show that I'm not aware of from the 80s? But just realised I was thinking of Mr. Ben. I thought he was asking if there was a Mr. Ben role-playing game. Anyway.
Whistle and I'll come to you.
Yeah.
I can't do the pod whistling now.
Killer Chandra asks, we all know Call of Cthulhu as one of the most recognizable classics adapted to RPGs. Is there any other well-known setting in the public domain you feel you should be adapting? Adapted?
Yes, and I'm not going to tell you.
Yeah.
There is an element where I have pages and pages. I've got notepads full of potential ideas. Some, I must have at least 5 books plotted out. But because I'm a professional writer and I also do paying gigs for other people, it works out on average. I write one of these about a year, and there is that paranoia. I don't want to give away a good idea. But yes, I mean, I've got loads. Well, shall I be bold and say?
I'll be bold.
Well, I could say one that hopefully isn't stepping on your toes.
Okay.
But like Jekyll and Hyde, for me, seems like
that's
one that's
on my list.
Okay, because it seems like one.
Okay. Well, as you've mentioned that, yeah, mine again, because it's a novella for a start, isn't it? There's not masses to the story, and it's told in that weird style where this is what I've experienced. Then I read the letter at the end to find out what was going on at the same time. So obviously I wouldn't do it in that way. But it's going to. I've got this plotted out. It's going to be my first. I've not written a 2-player game book before, so it's going to be that. So the idea is, you can either play as Jekyll, or you can play as Hyde, or you can play with your friend and play as one character each. And the actions of each of you will affect what happens for the other person plays their bit.
Oh, amazing.
But it would go beyond the story as in Jekyll and Hyde, because I've now suddenly forgotten that the old man he kills, Leigh, the MP.
Sir Danvers Carew.
Yeah, not Leigh anything. Yeah, Sir Danvers Carew. That's going to be part of another plot strand, which I really don't want to give anything away about. But on the surface, it would be called Jekyll versus Hyde, is what I'm going to call it. And so you can either read it by yourself and still works, or you can play against somebody else.
Yeah.
Surely you're going to call it Dr. Jekyll and MR Hyde.
No, that's really cool. I think that's cool. I think that'd work. I think it'd work in an RPG context as well, because I think the theme of duality and contrast is so heavy in it that you could easily have a game that's built around all of your characters having a profound secret and living a profound double life.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about, again, stories having been adapted, that has been adapted so many times, and it just shows what a rich vein it was to tap into. The obvious one is the Hulk, and I'm a big fan of that, and those two sides and how they are sort of fighting against each other, or are they? Because one of the things, actually, I've mentioned Jekyll and Hyde, which I wouldn't do in my adaptation, but one of the things I think is that personally, Jekyll is the absolute worst. He's this horrible character who has these really dark thoughts, but I can't possibly do that. I'll create this elixir which lets me turn into Mr. Hyde. Then I can live out my most perverted fantasies. Yeah. But it all comes from Jekyll, and he knows what's going on. Whereas
I can go one stage further.
Yeah, go on.
I would argue there is no Mr. Hyde. Jekyll just changes his appearance. The only evidence we have for him being a different personality is Jekyll tells us that, but he also uses I interchangeably when he's describing himself as both Jekyll and Hyde. And at the end, they hear him crying in Hyde's voice but there's no reason for Hyde to be crying. It's Jekyll who's crying. So yeah, but Hyde doesn't exist. He's
and
a
when
dirty
they
liar
break,
and
they
hypocrite.
find it's Jekyll's body, isn't it? Good point.
Yeah, it's a really good book for diving into, because for all it's really short, it's just replete with so much commentary and critique about Victorian society, and with all of its duality and how people present themselves, but how they actually are. And I think that could also be a really nice, just in terms of adapting it, potential point of modern satire for looking at our own current society and how people claim they're one thing, but look who's coming into power. How on earth did this come into power if everybody claims that they don't believe in all these things that the people they voted for have reached into power? There's all manner of fun things that you could do to add in a modern twist to it as well.
Yeah,
that's more profound than I was going to say. I was just going to say like Instagram and TikTok filters. Okay,
but no, it's all the same. It's
profound.
No, I think that's just as deep. It's the duality that we live today in comparison to the dualities of the Victorian era, the double lives.
Well, certainly. I mean, even now, talking to you guys, this is one version of me, and I possibly play up to a certain aspect of it. And when I do events, and if you're in a panel, people expect to be a certain way, and I'll try to make a few jokes. And when I tweet things, it tries to be positive. I don't necessarily want people to see warts and all, and people I don't think want to hear about me about how I was really miserable today. I haven't got anything done. It's really annoying. First world problems in the situation. But yeah, absolutely, everybody lives with that.
Make it a double bill with picture of Dorian Gray, or maybe Frankenstein.
Well, Dorian Gray is. I've got him appearing in the book as well. Yeah, because that's the other thing. One of the things I love about things like the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is just taking this mishmash of characters. But having mentioned that one, of course, in the movie version, which I know is roundly loathed, but I have to say I did like parts of it. And one of the things I did like was how they did Jekyll and Hyde, and he talks to himself in the mirror and kind of reconciles the two halves. But they had Tom Sawyer in that, who isn't in the original graphic novel. And I do want to do another, it would effectively be an original story, and it's called Judgment Day 1869, and it's my weird Western, but it would have characters from Mark Twain. So the full pretentious title to kind of fit in with the era would be Judgment Day 1869, the grievous zombie slaying adventures of Sheriff Tom Sawyer and the outlaw Huckleberry Finn.
Nice.
So
have you seen Penny Dreadful?
I haven't actually, no.
Oh, you
recommend
should, because we watched that, and it was almost like what I wanted the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen to be, and then they go on a Western adventure because there's an American character in it. So they end up going to America. I really enjoyed that, and it has loads of the same elements and the same nods to characters that you know, and characters that might be, etc.
I'll have to check it out. But I have to say, people are always surprised about the things I haven't seen. I've never seen an episode of Game of Thrones. I've never seen The Walking Dead. I've never seen the Rings of Power. It's just, to be honest, there just aren't enough hours in the day to watch lots and lots of TV. So.
I can't remember who's the
Eva Green.
No, not Eva Green. The older character, the Sean Connery.
That's James Bond as well.
Yes, Timothy Dalton.
Timothy Dalton. Thank you.
And is it Rory Kinnear's Frankenstein's monster?
Rory
the creature, sorry.
Yeah.
Adam.
And the main American young character is someone quite famous too.
Hey, he's the guy who's in Sin City. I've forgotten his name.
Yes, him. But yeah, it's good. Recommended. As Anonymous Play says, it's a masterpiece, apparently.
I think it's the one that dies in Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, well, go figure.
Is that Josh Hartnett?
That's his name.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. Well, I have to look it up now.
Josh Hartnett.
Yeah, because I was thinking Josh Brolin, but I knew it wasn't Josh Brolin, and it's Josh Hartnett. Yeah.
Anyway.
We've turned into a TV podcast.
Yeah.
So Kilishandra asks, do you feel unique game mechanics rather than simple adaptation to basic RPG or D20 is a better fit for classic RPG adaptations?
Well, because I'm creating a new role-playing game called The Box of Delights, the role-playing game, I would have to argue the former. I mean, obviously, because of recent events, that's worked out as a benefit. All those people are now boycotting D&D or 5th edition or the OGL. And obviously that's a problematic area, which we won't get into right now. But yes, I mean, part of it is that when I I've created a very simple rule set for my own game books, and then the role-playing games have kind of expanded on that. But part of it for me is I like it to be rules light because I like storytelling. So I don't want to spend hours going through multiple different manuals, checking this, that, and table about against others. It should, the story should be driving everything, to the point where, you know, if that dice roll's failed and it means they've died at the denouement, you know, fudge it. It's like that typical golden rule of role playing. It's got to be fun. So the rules aren't the most important thing for me. The setting is probably more important, but then as a result, the setting will give you an idea of what sort of mechanics you might want to include. So, for example, my whole Ace Gamebook series, you can play them using dice or playing cards, because the first one I did was Alice's Nightmare in Wonderland. And when I came to the end, I thought, but playing cards are such a big part of Alice, it would be silly not to have that option.
Yeah.
And then again, Ace Gamebooks weren't a thing at the time, but it became the name. So it's then become a feature of all of them. And again, the role-playing games use the same or similar mechanics. So yes, I think if it just helps kind of immerse in that world and that story. I'm trying to think of some others that I might have done, but off the top of my head. But it'll probably come back to me later when we've stopped talking.
Well, we've got a question. We've got a question in the comments from Mark. So, what do you think would be the most challenging classic to convert? I noticed nobody's talked at all about Shakespeare.
Oh well, that's my next one. It's literally when I've finished another job I've got to get done first. I want to do Shakespeare versus Cthulhu. You've mentioned Cthulhu already, because about 6 years ago I crowdfunded a short story anthology of the same title, and at the time I said, "And coming soon to Patreon, the game book." And it didn't happen then. But yes, so I want to do you are William Shakespeare, and you end up in your own plays, and there would be a mechanic in that called Where There's a Will. So why not? So yes. So you'll experience about 12 different plays, but yes, that's completely plotted out, ready to go. I've got my folders just over there with it all in. I've got the artist on board. Yeah, thank you.
I love the Jasper Ford Thursday Next series, which is all about like being a book detective and going in and out of books and stuff. So her son speaks his own language, and it's you know, the typesetting language. Yeah.
I know of them, but I've not read them. So yeah.
You might like Lindsay. There's a graphic novel series called Kill Bill, I think it's called. But it's basically a bunch of Shakespearean villains kind of get together because they're being tasked to go and kill Shakespeare, and then a bunch of Shakespearean heroes have to try and protect him. But then it starts asking, should they protect him given what he's put them through as characters and stuff? It's quite interesting, quite clever. So yeah.
I like
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I definitely like the sound of Shakespeare going into his own plays. So Mark, so giving the posthumous papers of the Pickwick Club your Dracula treatment, taking on the viewpoint of all these different characters.
Well, I did, again, a few years ago, I wanted to write, well, I did write a couple of stories, but what happens after A Christmas Carol? And I know that it says that Scrooge wasn't troubled by ghosts, but I wrote a novella, well, a long short story, a short novella, I don't know, but which has that a year later, Marley turns up again and realizes that because he helped Scrooge get out of his fix, that he started to lose padlocks and lockboxes from his chain, and therefore was shortening his time in purgatory. So he persuades Scrooge to become an occult detective to help him out and to help others. So I was then going to have them visit all sorts of different Dickensian characters. And I've written, the first one is based on another Christmas story. So it's got, oh no, I'm trying to remember the full title, but it's The Haunted Man and the Ghost Bargain. They're the two parts of the novella. And I also wrote one called Murder in the Cathedral, which is it solves the mystery of Edwin Drood. So, but I wanted to become a whole line, and the Pickwick Papers are part of it. And again, I had kind of a novel's worth plotted out, but it hasn't happened yet. That's the trouble. Too many ideas, not enough time.
Too many ideas. Yeah, that's the best kind of ideas to have, though. Too many. So please do check out Jonathan's Kickstarter, the Box of Lights Kickstarter. When is it open till, Jonathan?
So the 13th of February.
The 13th of February. So the link's there, the link's in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube afterwards, please like, subscribe, share, click all of those things that you need to click. And thank you so much, Jonathan, for coming on to talk to us. It's been really interesting. We've covered everything from Odysseus to Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure.
And next week we've got James Swallow coming on. You may know James because he's written every book that ever was written. Well, it's not quite true, but I'm pretty sure that Jonathan has written all the other books that weren't written by James. He's written everything from Tom Clancy to Marvel to various game fictions, and that's indeed what he's coming along to talk about, writing games fiction. It's going to be a really good one, I think. Plus, I would also like to add, if you are a supporter of independent gaming and authors, go back Jonathan's Kickstarter. It's as simple as that, because that's what we're all here for. We are all small press people trying to do the best for each other that we possibly can. And this, Jonathan, I think, is one of the best examples of our kind. His writing's marvelous. The books he do are full of creative, imaginative wonders for you to experience. So please do go take a look, because that's why we're all here and we love his stuff. So hopefully you will too. Go check out his Kickstarter. There's my impassioned plea. So other than that, I shall now sit back on my porcelain throne and consider my...
As Andy says, join us next week for James Swallow. But until then, thank you to Jonathan. Thanks to the two Andys. And all that remains to say is good night and caw-caw. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.